is a webinar that is a free webinar for anyone who has ever identified as an empath. So those of you who are on my mailing list or who follow me on social or who are just familiar with my coaching work, you know that I have been teaching about the identity of being an empath for a really long time. And it is, I first learned about what an empath was years and years ago. And as some of you may have seen in my recent content, and if you haven't, that is okay too. But I have really evolved in terms of what I know and what I teach on this topic. Everything I've ever taught, I still stand behind, but really the focus of this webinar is how the empath identity is really a trauma response. And regardless of if you identify as an empath, if you used to identify as an empath, if you view it as a gift, if you view it as a trauma response, if you aren't even sure if you are one or aren't one, if you are shifting away from the identity, you are, moving towards it, whatever the case may be, you will get to, there's actually a form where you could share a little bit more, especially if you decide to do, there's a course I have coming up on this topic, but wherever you are on that, inshallah, God willing, this will speak to you. So I am going to go to our next slide. And again, if you have any questions, just feel free to put them in the chat. They will be responded to later. Okay, so today we're going to cover a couple of things. We are going to cover what exactly it means to be an empath, a codependent, or an HSP, and how those things are similar and different. When I say HSP, I am talking about highly sensitive person. I'm going to cover the key differences between empaths and highly sensitive people, the differences between empaths and codependents, the benefits of these various labels, the limitations of the labels, some misconceptions about empaths, but also just the labels in general, and then what healthy empathy looks and feels like. And I'm going to share some really basic information about a 3-month course that I have coming up, and it's going to be very basic, and there'll be a link there. So if you're just here to get some content today and not interested in that, that's totally fine. And yes, let us move forward to the next slide. So first of all, I'm going to put a poll and ask, do you currently identify as an empath? You could share this. You don't have to, but the 3 options are yes, no, I'm not sure. And if you feel like your response doesn't really fit nicely into one of those boxes, into the yes, the no, the I'm not sure, then you could chat either publicly to the group or privately to me, kind of how you'd answer that. And if you don't feel like answering it, that is completely and totally fine as well. And if you're not completely sure, it will be a free resource, so it won't be something that is only available to those who take the 3-month course. I will be publishing some assessments very, very soon, where you can go through and get a little bit more clarity if you're not totally sure about these things. And really, for those of you who are new to my work, there are a few people either here or who have signed up and may listen to the recording who, may not know, but my goal as a coach, as an educator, is really never to define things for you, but rather to create a space and to provide resources so you can really come to certain conclusions on your own. There are places in our life where we definitely do need some kind of external information or guidance, but regardless, it's really important, for you to take ownership of what is important to you. So yeah, let's see here. So I think that you should be able to see the poll. And thank you for those of you who are being patient as I learn this new software. Obviously, even though this is a free webinar, your time is very, very respected. So maybe I should have done a little bit more practicing. I set everything up, but technical difficulties happen sometimes. But yes, just know that with any future courses or whatnot, everything will be definitely tested there. So yeah, if anyone wants to let me know in the chat if you can see the poll that I put out. And if you feel like answering that, you can go ahead. If not, that's totally fine. Now, I'm actually going to go backwards on this slide. We have the definition of an empath, a codependent, and an HSP. Regardless of where you personally fall, so some of you might know so much about these topics, and some of you may not, and maybe some of you fall somewhere in the middle. It doesn't matter. So you're not here to perform. But all I want to say is that there is so much more to these topics that we are not going to cover today. And there is so much nuance to these topics as well, that when we speak about them as a whole in a group, I will be categorizing things so that you can kind of assess your situation, but really it's going to vary on a case-by-case basis. Okay, so a lot of people are saying they can't see the poll. I'm going to hit publish. Okay, I guess I needed to hit publish. I hit start. So again, very cool software, but still I should have done a full live test run. So I apologize. And I'm just a one woman show right now, but for my upcoming course, I will be, I will have an assistant helping out with certain things. So wanted to see what this was like versus using like a Zoom. So yeah, if you want to participate in the poll, you can go ahead and do that. Again, it's not, I wouldn't think too much of it. So we have a couple of other polls, but it helps you kind of just think about these topics. So I want to start with what a highly sensitive person is and then work my way up. So a highly sensitive person is someone who has a sensitive nervous system and picks up on really, really subtle energy. Now, a lot of highly sensitive people are also codependent and or an empath. I will explain what those things mean for sure, but just because someone is a highly sensitive person does not necessarily mean they are an empath or a codependent. So if someone were to be highly sensitive, but not codependent, or not an empath, or not a codependent and an empath, then the difference between that person is a really strong sense of self. Now that kind of sounds like, so empaths, codependents don't have a strong sense of self. Empaths and codependents are very, very resilient, strong people, but the difference between a strong sense of self has nothing to do with strength. It has to do with just a sense of identity, a sense of where I begin and where you end. So the empath identity, the codependent identity, they are relational terms. Those only show up in relations to other people. And with the empath and codependent, there's more blurred lines between where an individual begins and where a person ends. This doesn't have to be good or bad, but I'm going to work through to explain exactly what I mean. If this is the first time you're hearing these concepts, this is pretty spoken about in different forums and whatnot, but also, when I send out those assessments, I will also be sharing scenarios. So if you're not familiar with what scenarios are, it's basically just, fictitious stories using characters. So you can really, if some of this stuff doesn't land with you tonight or today, depending on what where you are in the world and what time it is, then just know that it takes a little while to land and it really can be nuanced. And I'll give some examples today. Essentially, a codependent is someone who is a fixer, someone who takes on other people's responsibilities in a way that is dysfunctional. Now, we really can't act like anyone who identifies as codependent is exactly the same. It really is a spectrum. What I mean by that is someone may be kind of codependent versus someone who is like 100% codependent. So it's really going to vary, again, on a case by case basis. And there are questions you can ask yourself to kind of figure out where you may lie. Codependency only exists in relational dynamics. What I mean by this is that if you, so this is not how the world is designed, but let's just pretend for a moment that like literally you are the only person on the planet. There are no other people, or it's someone else. So there's a person on the planet. There's only one person on the planet, no other people ever. It is impossible for that person to ever be codependent because you cannot be codependent if there is not another person or people involved. It is a relational term. Now, if you have questions on that, you can absolutely submit some questions. I'm going to put in one of our other polls. I'm putting in a poll for codependency. And if you don't feel like sharing, you can absolutely just, answer these in your head. And I really also, even if you're answering these questions, so I put the new poll up, even if you're answering these, I just want to say that sometimes, it takes a little bit of a while. Like I'm going to be talking about attachment styles today. That's a really big topic, right? And I now have been familiarized with attachment styles for a while, both on a personal level and a professional level. I remember when I first heard about attachment styles, and if you don't know what that is, that's okay. But it takes a little bit of time to land. I wouldn't put yourself in a box, but with some of these things, a lot of people who, consume my work are very familiar with, the empath identity, codependency, HSP. If you don't, that's okay. But I just want to say that it's really important to view yourself bio-individually and figure things out from that perspective. Okay, so, and by the way, I love, those of you who are interacting in the chat, and I'm a little sad that, some people couldn't jump on because of our technical difficulties, but if you do decide to move forward with, some other content I have on this topic, I have a 3-month course coming out on this. It will be more interactive. It will be more of a video session and people interacting more. But today is a webinar, so it's really going to be content. You can absolutely chat in the box and interact with one another and submit the polls and put the questions in. But I just want to make that clear. Now, what is an empath and how does that differ? So empaths are both HSPs and codependents. Now, I don't like to say things like 100% explicitly because these are topics that are really also still being explored. And also they're just labels. So one thing that I came up with that we're going to hit maybe in a slide or two are what are the limitations to these labels? What are the benefits of these labels? And, with the exception of like HSP is a term that was coined, by an author and a doctor, Dr. Elaine Aron. And with the exception of that, there's a lot of different educational pieces on these different topics. But so I don't want to say like, is it completely impossible for an empath to not be an HSP, not codependent? I mean, not really, and I'll explain why. But again, please understand that there is always nuance. So first of all, let's talk about what an empath is. And again, we're really just hitting the surface level here. Empaths absorb and take on other people's emotions like they are their own. And empaths do way more than their fair share of emotional work in relationships. It also varies. It depends who that person is interacting with. And empaths pick up on subtleties and internalize responsibility for them. So some of these things might seem like, well, they kind of sound alike. That's why we're going to go to the slides that will come up in a little bit, where we're actually going to see what is the difference between an empath and a codependent. What is the difference between an empath and an HSP? And again, it's very possible, to hold all of these identities. So especially if one is an empath. So let's talk about the key differences. I'm going to end this poll now. And I'm going to start an HSP poll. If you feel like participating in that, you can. All right, so what are the key differences between empaths and highly sensitive people? So all empaths are HSPs, but not all HSPs are empaths. Empaths struggle with emotional boundaries. Now, with these next parts, I just want to make it really, really clear that I encourage you strongly not to diagnose yourself and to take this with informational purposes only. But complex post-traumatic stress disorder is something that should be considered. And I will get a little bit more later when we talk about, well, why is the empath identity a trauma response? And, if that's, a lot of people who are kind of in this space and know these things know a lot about that topic. If you don't, I really recommend that you don't just assume anything about yourself. It's really about education. And regarding HSPs, complex post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder is something to consider here. Now, what is the difference between those two things? So post-traumatic stress disorder might happen if someone endured a really traumatic one-time incident. So let's say that someone was in, I want to say a war zone, but unfortunately, anyone who's been in that kind of situation, they often have been in those situations more than once. But it's not impossible if someone's been in a really intense situation like that for there to be like a one key incident that's occurred. That might result in post-traumatic stress disorder, right? So if someone hears a sound that is similar, that may be triggering for them. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and if you want to learn more about these things, there's some really great therapists that talk about these topics. But complex post-traumatic stress disorder is actually post-traumatic stress disorder that occurs more so in relational dynamics from repetitive things. So if someone is in a toxic environment, whether it be a child in a household or any sort of toxic environment. It could be a romantic relationship, it could be a toxic workplace, but somewhere where there are numerous counts or incidences that kind of happen over and over again, that is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's a little bit different. And if you have specific questions on that, I encourage you to submit them to be answered for the questions, the Q&A that I'll be writing up after this webinar. But that's what I'll leave it at for that. Now, what are the differences between empaths and codependents? So again, empaths are emotionally codependent, meaning that they take responsibility for other people's emotions. And that doesn't have to happen all of the time. So when we get to talking about attachment styles, that'll give a little bit of clarity as to why sometimes that may happen and sometimes it may not. Codependence, a lot of codependents are also empaths, but some codependents are codependent but not empaths, because those would be people who are physically codependent but not emotionally codependent. Let me give you an example. So let's say you have a mother that is codependent. Now, it's tricky because, again, you can't just, being responsible for someone or caretaking is not considered codependent. If someone is taking care of their child, or they are fulfilling relational obligation or responsibility, or taking care of someone who's sick, or they just love being a caretaker, that doesn't necessarily mean they are codependent. Codependency occurs when someone really doesn't have, there are really blurred lines in terms of their own identity and their own care. Now, obviously, if someone is a mother or a caretaker, there's so many different ways to be a caretaker, a father. And I know that a lot of women tend to sign up for my classes, my courses, my coaching, but I do work with men. And even though we often do see codependency in women, it is, there is a lot of this as well with males. But again, every situation is different. And if you require something specific to you, to how, your walk of life, then the Q&A is going to be the best place to get some info on that. But I just want to say that because we often think of caretaking as mothers. But regardless, codependency occurs when it is dysfunctional, when it is a loss of identity, a loss of care. And sometimes some people may be physically codependent, right? So let's say we take something like, let's say like an abusive or toxic situation, right? And let's say that a mother has a teenager, and that teenager, does something that is not okay, or that is, destructive in any sort of way. It would be codependent to clean up that teenager's mess. Now, a mother or a father should obviously provide guidance because they are in the parental roles and they are the ones in charge. But guidance and education and responsibility is very different than taking responsibility for something. That blurs the lines of who is actually responsible. Now, that may happen physically sometimes, right? Someone could be physically codependent, but empath is really about the emotional codependency, the psychological codependency. So as I answer some more questions and we go through the slides, it's okay if you're not totally getting, or maybe you are, I don't want to make an assumption, but it does take a little while to untangle these different things. And again, I'll be sharing some specific scenarios. Now, attachment styles. Empaths usually have a fearful avoidant attachment style, while a codependent could either be fearful avoidant or anxious attachment style. Now, the best way I could describe attachment styles, I'm going to write the 4 in the chat. Okay, so thank you so much for those of you who are sharing in the chat. And, obviously, please know, anything you share in the chat. If you want anything to be private, you want to send that to me publicly. But I love that you're sharing. There's nothing, it's awesome that people are sharing about their health, their mental health and whatnot. And that is great. But also just recognize, if you want anything not to be, this is not like a big public forum or anything like that, but just know more so for your own health information. But I'm going to write about attachment styles. So give me a moment here. There are 4. And I'm not going to go too much in depth today on attachment styles here. There is some content I will put out, but I'm going to share enough that it's helpful for what we're talking about today, inshallah, God willing. Okay, so the best way to really describe each of these is that anxious attachment really has to do with being very preoccupied with relationships, all types of relationships, and being, there's a slide where I'll actually share that, but wanting to be in connection with others in a way that may not be. In a way that has some form of insecurity. Like a secure attachment style is someone who is comfortable being alone, comfortable interacting with others. Fearful avoidant, there's a little bit of push and pull. Anxious attachment is a push, avoidant attachment is a pull. That's the best way that I could describe it, and we will go a little bit more in detail. Now, what are the benefits of these labels? So labels give you direction, right? So each of you who are listening, you're here, you have different walks of life, you have different situations, you may have different goals. You definitely have different goals, but labels give you a direction, first of all. Labels also allow for community support, an opportunity to be seen, to be understood, to be validated. And I want to ask you this question, and you can, kind of think about it personally. If you want to share in the chat, you can. You do not have to. But how do you think these labels benefit you personally? And this may not be something you think of like right on the spot, but just something that you think of and kind of reflect on. Now let's talk about some limitations of labels. So first of all, we have to consider cognitive dissonance. So labels are only as helpful as how accurate they are. Funny that I have a typo in the word accurate, but it's totally fine. If someone mislabels themselves due to cognitive dissonance, this can make a label a disadvantage. Now, I wouldn't stress too much about like the perfect labels, especially if this is something that you are new to. If you are here and you know exactly how you identify and you're just soaking up more, then that's awesome. But everyone's going to be different, right? Sometimes labels can cause isolation because it's really important to integrate them with just our larger world, right? So it's awesome when we have places where we feel seen, labels where we feel seen, but those same labels that help us feel seen in one place could also sometimes create isolation if they're not handled with nuance, wisdom, and integrated into everyday life, especially in situations where someone may not totally get any of this stuff. So those are some of the limitations. And then a little bit of a question to ask yourself: how do labels limit you? So I just assumed, but I want to check in to see how everyone's doing. I assume you can see when I'm changing through all the slides, right? So I've probably been through I'm on slide 7 now. If anyone wants to let me know, it would be super appreciated. And meanwhile, I'm going to do something with our poll. Okay. Okay, so on the next slide here, I have 3 misconceptions. So the first one is, something that's really big. It's actually, I'm going to Google it right now. I think the first time the word empath was used, I'm going to see if I could find it. It was like in the science fiction world. Yeah, it originates from science fiction literature, and it was considered emotional, being able to kind of tell what other people are thinking and stuff like that. The term has also, thank you so much for the person who told me that they can see the slides change. So something that's really common, especially regardless of the science fiction origins, this is still kind of common, and it's even pretty common within like new age spirituality. And again, I'm not here to tell anyone what to believe in or what not to believe in, but I am coming at this from an Islamic lens, which people can, you may identify with that, and a lot of people that consume my content do. And even outside of that, also matching things up to logic and science. So something that is common, is sometimes people who kind of have the empath identity, sometimes there's this common belief that empaths could kind of predict the future. Now, why this is a misconception is because empaths are conditioned by their respective traumas to pay attention to very, very small detail. And our nervous systems, the way that our nervous systems are designed to predict outcomes. That's the way our brain works. That's the way our entire nervous system. If we really look at, yes, people who are like really intense empaths often do know how to like walk into a room and sense the energy in the room, or kind of know what someone's thinking. But it's not because they have some kind of knowledge that's not available to other people. They're very, very tuned in. And anyone could know the information that an empath knows if they are that tuned in. For people who believe in God or, in Islam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we believe that only God knows everything. And obviously, if anyone knows anything that is unseen, it is only through God. Now, regardless of what, someone may believe or whatnot, I think the biggest proof of this outside of religious beliefs is, again, anything that someone knows is information that anyone could know. But the truth is there could be 10 people in a room, and the same person, or this 2 different people or 3 different people in that room, could have completely different circumstances depending on what they're tuned into. So the empath identity is really about being tuned into certain things. And I have coached and taught a lot regarding being an empath and whatnot. And often those who identify with being an empath feel a little bit of a push and pull, because it's almost like it feels very personal that this is part of their identity, and moving away from that feels kind of like self-betrayal, if that makes sense. But we're going to talk about something that's interesting. And again, at the end of the day, it's completely up to each individual, like what they want. In this webinar, I'm essentially sharing how being an empath is a trauma response and what healthy empathy really looks like. But at the end of the day, how, and I'm someone who identified with being an empath for a long time, until I really became more trauma informed and learned more about certain things and practiced more personally and professionally. And, it's interesting, because I think once you identify as an empath, in some ways you kind of always do, but it's very different in terms of making a cognitive or cognizant kind of intentional decision to move away from that identity towards healthy empathy. And this is it's not my place to say what's good or what isn't. You have to decide on your own. But the next misconception is that empaths are born as empaths. And the thing is no one is born hyper focusing on other people's emotion. This is a learned behavior. We're going to talk about that a little bit, especially when we compare it to empathy. Often learned in early childhood, but not always. So again, this is why it's so important to respect your life and your story and your experiences to really figure out, why certain things may be true for you. It could also be learned later on in life in attachment relationships. And for many people, it's often both. And if you have questions on that, or anything, you can absolutely submit a question, inshallah. So the next misconception is that being an empath is part of someone's authentic self. First of all, empaths are really big-hearted people, mashallah. And, the thing is that a lot of times being so caught up in someone else's personal experiences or someone else's emotions is very natural to a lot of people who identify as an empath. And it almost feels like, well, if I'm not that, who am I? But the thing is that if we look at being an empath through the lens of being a trauma survivor, and trauma varies so much. So there may be questions on that, but there's so many different forms of trauma. Trauma could occur in very obvious, chaotic, clear cut, wow, that was traumatic. And sometimes it could also occur in situations that seemingly look really good and really calm. But there are key things to look for. So we will talk about that. And so, but not everyone who is a trauma survivor ends up being an empath. Some people actually end up on the opposite side of the spectrum, and the thing is that typically people who are empaths have high empathy, but they also learn responsibility in a certain way as opposed to entitlement, which I will talk about a little bit more. So okay, I'm going to go to the next slide. And I know in about 2 minutes, we're going to hit our original end time. So if you have to go, I'd love for you to stay and I'll be here. We will go our full hour and 15, like I said, but being that we had to start a little bit late due to the new room, if you have to go, you will get a recording. I believe it lasts a little while here on Webinar Jam, but I am also planning to save it elsewhere as well. So let's talk about top reasons why people are empaths. And I'm going to put a poll out regarding this. I'm going to run it now, but I would hold off on answering it till I explain this slide. So the new poll is, do any of these experiences hold true for you? I don't think you can each see the answers. I don't even think, even now when I see some people say, click on the polls, it doesn't show me who is doing what. I might be able to see that later. But yeah, let's go through this. So top reasons why people are empaths. So I narrowed it down to 4 because I really feel like almost everything else could fall into one of these things. But again, we want to look at things with nuance. So, we're never looking at this like it's case closed. But being an empath is a trauma response usually occurring in attachment relationships. And I spoke a little bit about attachment styles, right? Let's really talk about what are attachment relationships. Attachment relationships are basically any sort of relationship. It could be familial with your family. It could be friendships. It could be professional. It could be romantic. It could be any kind of relationship that is with a human. The reason I say human is because we all also have relationships to things like food, our work, our responsibilities, our, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our creator, that may vary depending on people's beliefs. We all have various relationships. So when we talk about attachment relationships, we can look at those inanimate kind of objects. Not all of them are inanimate, but if we talk about objects, we also have relationships to objects. We can kind of look at those through attachment relationships as well, but we're really talking about people here. Now, let's say you just meet someone and you barely know them. That is not an attachment relationship. Attachment relationships is really when someone gets any sort of closeness or intimacy to another person. Intimacy does not need to mean, it just means closeness. That could look very different in terms of the kind of relationship it is. If it's a friendship, if it's a parent-child, it's a sibling, it's a work relationship, that just means, interacting and really getting to know someone. This kind of also explains attachment theory and attachment styles, and attachment relationships also explains why sometimes things change, especially when you get to know someone more and more. So this is really helpful information. Now, the first reason is something called enmeshment. Now, enmeshment usually occurs in familial dynamics, but it could also show up in other places, other attachment relationships like friendships or professional ties. It basically the easiest way to explain it. And there's a ton of, if you want this from, I'm coming from a coach and an educator point of view, but there's a ton of therapists who specialize in this, who share this stuff online in ways that are more, layperson friendly. There's obviously books too, if you're into psychology, but basically enmeshment occurs when there is no clear line drawn of where I begin and where you end, where you begin and where I end. There are blurred boundaries and autonomy. So it's really common for a lot of people to grow up in households that are enmeshed, especially if it's almost like, for example, if one person is feeling something in the household, now everyone is feeling something in the household, or if there aren't clear boundaries, right? So enmeshment is really common. It could happen in the worst of situations, and it could also happen in really well-intentioned, loving households that for whatever reasons, there could be a lot of reasons that enmeshment occurs, depending on the parents' attachment styles, the trials, the tribulations. If we look at this from an Islamic lens for a moment, we do see that Islam really, really values boundaries, that it really values clear cut where I begin and where you end. But enmeshment is so common. And even in religious or spiritual settings, oftentimes people who have certain beliefs and want good things, sometimes enmeshment could even happen through those forms and may show up even in the form of like spiritual abuse. So there's so much more on that topic, but basically, if anyone has been in a situation where it's kind of like there isn't full permission to know where each person begins and ends, it makes a lot of sense why someone may end up being an empath, because early on that person took on the emotions of other people. Now, not everyone, again, you can have 10 different children in 5 different households who go through similar situations. Not all of them are going to end up being empaths. There's certain things that come together, but enmeshment is one reason. If you have any questions, you can submit that for the Q&A. The next one is abandonment wounding. So abandonment wounding is the fear of being alone. So that's just like a really, really, really very broad kind of way to get the point across. But for example, like if you hear that and you think like, oh, well, I could be alone, that doesn't necessarily mean that one does or doesn't have a fear of being alone. Someone who has secure attachment is okay with being alone and also okay being close to other individuals. But abandonment wounding creates a trauma response of being clingy. I'm not a big fan of the word clingy, but it's the best word to get my point across. I have to find a better word for that. Especially, I think it's more so because it's popularized to be this negative thing. But anyone with an abandonment wound has deep abandonment pain that has not been addressed in one way or another. And often people with abandonment wounding need a lot of reassurance in relationships of all sort. And abandonment wounding is often generated by unfulfilled promises, abuse, neglect, or unclear communication. On the flip side, what is really nourishing to anyone who has any sort of abandonment wounding is clear communications, respectful boundaries, knowing what to expect. We obviously live in this world where we are not in charge, right? There is the fate of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There are things that we can control and there are things outside of our control, right? And so the goal here is not to always know what to expect, but abandonment wounding doesn't just happen out of nowhere. It's not like someone gets one unfulfilled promise, but it could be it's especially common if someone grew up in a household where maybe their physical needs were taken care of, but their emotional needs weren't. And that doesn't mean parents are bad, right? Most parents try to do their best. But that's one example. It could show up, abandonment wounding can show up a lot if someone's in a narcissistically abusive romantic relationship, although that could come up in other forms of relationships as well. I'll hold off there because there's a whole category on narcissistic abuse, which is something that's really, really commonly discussed a lot, especially on the internet these days, and some of which is very helpful and some of which sometimes could be used in ways that maybe isn't fully accurate is the best way to describe it. The next form of wounding is avoidant wounding. So avoidant wounding is a fear of secure intimacy, the fear of being seen, the fear of being known. It creates a trauma response of wanting to hide, wanting to retreat, wanting to isolate. This is often generated by being shamed in one way or another, especially somewhere that means a lot to you, or having one's boundaries severely or even not severely infringed upon. So if we all need personal space. So someone who has a secure attachment style still needs personal space. For wanting personal space, that doesn't make someone avoidant. Sometimes people who are avoidant, in one way or the other, could have been in any sort of situation where that kind of personal space was not respected. It could be physical. It could also be emotional. So that could, and this is why a lot of times too, empaths tend to be fearful avoidant, because a lot of empaths have both some level of avoidant wounding, some level of abandonment wounding. Next, the fourth top reason is narcissistic abuse. So this is perhaps one of the most dysfunctional manifestations of being an empath. And essentially being an empath, not always, but can often be a magnet to narcissistic abuse. Doesn't mean that it is like the empath's fault, but the thing is that an empath often sees themselves as an extension of other people, and someone who's narcissistic sees other people as an extension of themselves. And when we're talking about narcissistic, we're really talking about people with narcissistic tendencies. You may have heard of something called NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, which is like the clinical diagnosis, and that's definitely not what we're saying here. But regardless, narcissistic abuse can create an empath in someone that really wasn't prior, or further traumatize someone who is already an empath. So those are some of the top reasons. If any of these experiences you feel hold true for you, you could take the poll. You don't have to. You can kind of keep that to yourself. Again, this is like, we're talking about a lot of different things, but there's more to talk about. My goal, you should have your own goal as to why you're here. It doesn't have to be like super fancy, like you didn't have to write it down or anything. But the goal of today's webinar is to really open up to more detail as to why being an empath is a trauma response, in what ways it shows up, how it varies with different identities, what healthy empathy looks like and how that varies from being an empath. And then in terms of, if this feels like it's something that holds true for you, you may want to consider my, I have a 3-month empathy reset course, which is basically about moving from the empath identity to healthy empathy. So first of all, empathy is a learned skill. So SEL skills, if any of you follow me on social media, you might have seen I posted a little bit about SEL not that long ago, but anyone in the education world. So especially if any of you are teachers, or if you don't have to be a teacher to be familiar with this, but this is something that's getting taught in schools more these days. And there's a lot of different organizations, but CASEL is the leader in terms of social emotional learning skills. There's basically 5 that people have to learn. And empathy, the ability to feel what someone else is feeling, is a learned skill. Okay. And empathy is really important for being a person who can step into someone else's experience. But the truth is that the empath identity is not true empathy. It doesn't mean that, like, if you're an empath, like, you're not empathetic. That is not what I'm saying at all. But functional empathy that, produces, really healthy relationships. So what does healthy empathy look like? It means understanding someone else's experience. So an empath absolutely understands someone else's experience, but it also is from a place of kind of being sucked into other people's. A lot of empaths will report that they, feel certain emotions that they, don't want to, absorb, or like they're a sponge, almost like it's out of their control. It's understanding someone else's experience while maintaining the lines of autonomy, where someone begins, where someone ends, caring for others, caring for yourself. Healthy empathy looks like not taking things personalized, even when it's personalized. So I definitely recognize some names, not just those of you who are here live right now, but in the just regular sign up, of people who have taken my emotional freedom mastery course from years ago. And if you can, some of you have taken it also, not when it was live, but just on your own in Glow Academy. Now, one of my rules is not the best word, but one of the things, the 5 things in the first class I spoke about was not taking things personal. Now, when we learn about attachment style, what's cool about that is sometimes, you could be like, well, Yasmin, some people do things and it feels really personal. I hear this a lot. Yeah, it could be personal to you because of how you're interacting with that other person, but essentially everyone does something from their own individual place. When we talk about relational dynamics, how we show up in relations, we do influence each other, but healthy empathy really understands that everyone's experience is their own experience. Also, healthy empathy looks like staying present in your mind and grounded in your physical body. It looks like being empathetic and kind and not having that fatigue or that burnout that often comes. It also looks like also receiving. So maybe none of those things happen. Maybe, for a lot of empaths, I could even think of myself, before I really was consciously moving away from that identity, I wouldn't say that empathy felt like a burnout, like, caring for others. It's just very natural. But the difference is that when someone's in the empath identity versus being in a more, healing any traumas. And I don't want to act like that's like something that you just check off. It's a process. And I don't want to act like secure attachment means like someone is never, struggling or anything like that, because that's not what it means. It just means most of the time their relational patterns go a certain way. But even if you don't experience burnout, even if you take care of yourself, empaths tend to attract people with low empathy. Empaths tend to attract, because it's just like it's an imbalance. And also with healthy empathy, one also attracts, even if you are interacting with the same exact person, how you show up. It's not that you're responsible for anyone else, but how you show up changes how people show up as well. So it's just a healthier space. Healthy empathy feels calm versus sometimes, being an empath could feel chaotic. It feels loving both ways, receiving and giving. Regardless of what someone else does, because sometimes some people will just, they'll need to be boundaries with certain people, it's dignified. So a lot of times, things could be not very dignified. in terms of the empath identity, and it's also present. It's not from a place of fear or lack or past. Now, as I mentioned before, shifting to true empathy is a personal choice, but it ultimately means developing secure attachment style. A secure attachment style allows for optimal mental and physical well-being, true fulfillment in relationships. It also means regulating and healing the nervous system. Now, this one I think is where a lot of, and maybe you feel this way, maybe you don't. You can absolutely share here privately or just think to yourself. A lot of empaths struggle with this. And it may be true for you, it may not be true for you, but sometimes, like I mentioned before, people really, really, really strongly identify. So, for example, this was a while back. So I'll quote this experience when I was working with one of my coaching clients, but this absolutely, I've heard this in one way or another from so many different people. But what's interesting is this was coming from it's not interesting because I think the only reason I say it's interesting is because we have these like preconditioned beliefs on who may be a certain way. But this is a teenage male who was basically talking about how having less empathy, and I wasn't, that's, if any of you, I think some of you here have experienced my coaching, but my style is not like, I would never be coaching someone and be like, oh, I think you should, shift away from the empath identity. I don't, especially when I'm coaching teenagers, completely different process than an adult. But of course, if someone is, oh, I want to shift away from this, then yes, I work with people in that way. But this person was basically sharing how much they could get sucked into other people's experiences and how not doing that seems like he didn't know if he won't even like what that would even mean, because sometimes it's like people just get so used to like how they are, if that makes sense, and it feels like it's part of their identity. But the truth is that the only reason why empaths pay attention to things that people who are not empaths do not pay attention to is because at one point or another, paying attention was necessary for survival. It could have been growing up in a very chaotic environment. It could have been growing up in a half chaotic, half loving environment. It could have been growing up in what seemed to be a good environment, but was like Cold War-ish, where like you didn't know what to expect. It could have been wonderful childhood, but somehow got entangled with a romantic partner or a close friend who did things like the silent treatment or any kind of psychological or emotional abuse that kind of leaves someone more self-conscious, more paying attention to certain things. It could have been getting bullied. It could have been, there's so many different things, but you're never going to find a reason why someone is an empath that was like a peachy environment. Now, here's the thing, especially for those of you who are Muslims, which are a lot of people who signed up, but even if you're not, a lot of people might hold this belief regardless of what you believe in, faith-wise. We are here to be tested. Bad things are sometimes going to happen to us, right? And there's a lot to be said about like character being built and all of that, and accepting one's fate, not faith, although, that's good too. The thing is you are never, though, going to find a situation. It is different to accept one's fate than it is to think like that, chaos is okay, or that we need to be on high alert all the time. Now, that might just be your reality, but the thing is that, and that's not just something that could be stopped right away, but there are a lot of things that could be done to heal the nervous system. You really got to make a decision, though. At the end of the day, noticing things takes up a lot of energy. It taxes the nervous system. A lot of people who are empaths go through a lot of emotional highs and lows. And even if they don't, it might show up in different ways. Some people view it as, some people will call it like a gift and a curse, for example. It really depends what you want in your life. But the bottom line is that Noticing things takes up a lot of energy, like I said, and it taxes the nervous system as well as many other systems in the body, such as adrenals. Regulating and healing the nervous system brings renewed vitality and energy. And the thing is that as crazy as it may seem, if you are someone who notices everything, there's a lot of liberation in not noticing certain things. And that doesn't mean one needs to become oblivious. That one of the biggest things I hear is like, oh, well, I can't do that because like I want to care. You could absolutely care. You will actually find that through empathy, you are more likely to go into someone else's experience, right? With that compassion that you already have in a way that is healthier for both and really is less about you. Because when it's a trauma response, it's about you to a certain degree, although empaths tend to be very giving. It also is very clarifying for one's mental thoughts and identities. Getting to know yourself outside of trauma is not glamorous. It's a process. But, and I just say that because I don't want to act like, oh, it's just so easy and whatnot. But it also brings so many benefits. And it could also lead to finally feeling whole. So we are humans, we are needy, we are, we need other people need us. It's not about being superhuman or, whatever, but it is about feeling whole as just an individual, as an imperfect human. So that is it for today. We've been running for about almost an hour and 14 minutes. So everything worked out, minus starting late. And I thank you for those of you who stuck around till now. If you have any questions you would like me to answer, you can send them to me privately in the chat. I will be here for a few minutes, or you can send them where everyone could see them. Or some of you submitted questions in the little pre-class survey. I will answer all of those in written form. You can also email me. Now, I will be having a 3-month empathy reset course that is going to be starting soon. I have some info here on that, and I will put up 2 things on the screen if you want some information and want to be added to an interest form. There's a link here that you could go to. And if you have any questions, but basically it will be a 3-month course. It will be 3 live classes, a little bit different than this. Everyone will be on video and live. Although if you don't want to be on video, you don't have to be. Each class will be accompanied by a presentation, a recording, homework. There will also be 3 live chatting sessions, like office hours, where people could answer things, get things answered, and people will be matched up to a partner. So all that information is there. If anyone wants to chat me any questions, then go ahead and those will be answered. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your patience. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. I will still be around here if anyone wants to submit anything for maybe like 3 minutes or so.